The U.S. Army seems to be finally admitting it needs to learn the lessons from the Ukraine conflict. And is Ukraine pushing back against Russia? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So the first story I want to talk about is, of course, the front line here. And what I think is interesting is, again, we're seeing the only place that Russian forces have made any kind of measurable advance is outside of Orlivka. And here's what I thought was interesting. As we've talked about, that we sort of figured that Russian forces were being funneled by Ukrainian forces into this low ground here. And you can see right here, this is where three rivers are meeting. And it seems like they've done exactly that. Now you can see this town here, Tonenke, is somewhat surrounded by Russian troops, though it looks like the Ukrainian troops may have some high ground here to the northeast of the town. But the most important thing is that Russian forces sort of remain contained on both the east side of this river here. And again, I think as long as they're contained to the north of this small stream here, you're going to see Russian forces really not be able to effectively go on the offensive. And it's hard to do river crossings. It's hard to do river crossings, period. And it's very hard to do river crossings under fire. So I think the Russian forces surging forward into this extremely low ground while Ukrainian forces control the heights is a terrible idea for the Russian forces, but well within the plans of Ukrainian forces. Again, we're seeing Russia take some of this town of Orlivka, but that doesn't really worry me, again, because I think Ukrainian forces are collectively west of this river here and using this as a natural obstacle to block Russian advances. The only other area where we're seeing some change is actually outside of Marinka here. And you can see yesterday, right, Russian forces occupying this small windbreak here, and they've been forced out of it in a counterattack, probably to prevent Ukrainian forces from being pushed up against this river and forested region here. You can see there's these large bodies of water interconnected with a small river, and that's not a great place to be fighting with your back against an obstacle like this. So that's likely what this was probably doing. You can also see, right, if they had to retreat, retreating across and doing a river crossing under fire is worse than having to do a river crossing while attacking. So they're definitely, I think, trying to avoid this situation and ensure they have what's called freedom of maneuver, which is the ability to conduct a controlled withdrawal if the situation requires it. And that means keeping the Russians beaten back into the area of Marinka proper. Again, I think we're seeing the overall pivot to the Ukrainian strategy here is focusing on on primarily defense in depth, right? Inflicting casualties, being willing to yield a little bit of territory to the Russians. Again, zooming out, you see that in the grand scheme of things, Ukraine can afford to take steps back, a few hundred meters without really suffering substantial operational failures, right? There's no cities here, not within the next couple of really couple dozen kilometers that are substantive, that are a real danger for Ukrainian or in danger of falling to Russian troops, right? Kharkiv, maybe the biggest one, maybe this Dnipro, but perhaps Mykolaiv. But again, the Russians are not crossing this river. So all in all, again, we're seeing increasing stabilization across the front line, which is good for Ukraine, given that I think they are holding out that there may be additional aid coming their way. Either from the Europeans or from the Americans. Now, if you are interested in seeing some of the fighting from this region, you want to become a member at combatvetnews.com. You guys know sponsors, they're pretty hard to come by at this point, and I rely on you guys, the viewers, to support this channel and keep me operational. So twice a week, I find the most viral combat footage on the entire internet, and I do a deep dive breakdown of it on the channel here. I just did a breakdown of Civdiv's Foreign Legion sniper operation when he was defending Bakhmut. And so it's a really interesting look at how snipers fight. And of course, we're going to be doing some even more intensive combat footage that's dropping today. So become a member, combatvetnews.com. Okay, now let's talk about what I thought was one of the most interesting stories. This is that the U.S. Army has admitted, somewhat belatedly, that they have to start thinking a lot differently about the war that they are going to be fighting in the future. Now that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are over, the U.S. Army has to pivot. They've realized that they cannot keep training soldiers to fight a counterinsurgency in a desert. They have to be prepared to fight a more sophisticated, more capable enemy. And to do that, they are revamping the way things work at their National Training Center. Now, for the record, as a military police unit, believe it or not, we never rotated to the National Training Center. Military police battalions don't usually do it. We have a law enforcement mission at home. And so instead, we end up training locally. So I never set foot at NTC, but I'll tell you this, I've never heard anything good about it. It always seems to me like they do so much what we call hand waving, which is they take really substantive, tough to solve military problems and they just say, don't worry about it, right? And that isn't really how real war works, right? Even dumb problems can stop an operation. Sitting there and saying, we're going to pretend like your vehicles always run. We're going to pretend like there's never any mud. We're going to pretend like we're going to do all these extra steps for safety compliance that you would never really do. Sometimes they would even say you can't even dig up a fighting position in certain areas because it's damaging to the environment. And it's like, guy, if the environment is also damaged by losing a war, I don't know what to tell you. So this is kind of an interesting article breaking down just some of the changes that have happened at the NTC. So let's see if I can find it. Here's an example of the hand waving that I talk about. In this part, they say the logistic portion of NTC increasingly strives for realism. Before recent changes, units receiving artillery shells would receive virtual shells. They would just say, shells received, you've got them. The convoy with the shells has arrived. And now they have to actually move mock rounds or like dud rounds, but they weigh the same as the real thing. Again, this is something where if you ask a Ukrainian, they're like, yeah, getting artillery shells to the front is a pain in the ass and a huge deal. Also, like, what do your artillery crews do if they don't load the rounds? Like, do they just sit at the gun and like watch TikToks on their phone and go, rounds out, rounds complete? Yeah, like I said, I don't feel like I missed anything with NTC, but there are changes that are positive, not just forcing soldiers to actually do their jobs. For example, they allow soldiers in some units to actually use Starlink and other commercial off-the-shelf systems, given that we've seen footage of Ukrainian talks that look way different from a U.S. talk. And the U.S. is trying to borrow some of those ideas, right? They allow cheap, commercially available tech over multi-billion-dollar weapons acquisitions. So again, you look at Starlink or some of their competitors are now able to be used. Talks now look way smaller. One battalion they interviewed here said that they actually run their talk with a projector, no cables, just a projector and a laptop, and that's the talk. The other example that now soldiers at NTC, again, this is just incredible hand waving. Instead of actually conducting an operation where your unit moves into a combat zone, they would get bussed into NTC, spend 3 days doing administrative stuff, and then would enter the box. But now they're at least trying to have them, for example, maneuver into the NTC and set up. So good changes, positive changes, but probably still a long way from the real war. What's interesting, though, is that basically they have said that the entire time convoys of U.S. The training soldiers are there, they're expected to be under observation from small UAS systems, small drones, right? And we've seen that basically the entire battlefield of Ukraine is under virtually constant drone observation. What's interesting, they also say that in the past, command posts would never be threatened, which is also not something like in Iraq and Afghanistan. Command posts were always under threat all the time. And unfortunately, I've seen tons of command staff posts when I was deployed just stop what they're doing when they get an attack anywhere on their base. Literally, I was told to like park my vehicles because the battalion headquarters 2 hours away was taking mortar fire. And I'm like, this is stupid. But this is the kind of thing that the U.S. Army is finally waking up to the fact that, yeah, your command post might get struck and your command post might actually just have your commander be killed or wounded, or your command staff. Suddenly, your companies or your platoons may have to complete the mission on their own without a big, elaborate command post. And this is the kind of thing that is just reality for Ukrainian soldiers, right? For example, again, units in some NTC rotations that were hit by simulated fire would just call a simulated medevac helicopter to get soldiers away from the spot. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, that was the norm. It was expected. Now, wounded soldiers are expected to be moved back to a casualty collection point and medevaced via vehicles. Again, something that in Ukraine, I've never seen a Ukrainian soldier get picked up via a helicopter. I've only ever seen them medevaced. They've added jamming. And of course, one of the most important things is that they have to dig fighting positions. They have finally told soldiers that you have to dig foxholes, right? And boy, howdy, this is how it is. From 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. the previous night, soldiers were up digging foxholes in cold, wet weather in the Louisiana forest. And they said, one soldier said, quote, "I hope they come. I didn't dig this for no reason." Oh, buddy, I got bad news for you. Digging is just what infantry does. Digging is what soldiers do, right? As they say, we've got to get serious about dig or die, said Taylor. When simulated artillery lands, quote, "we're going to be very unkind to you as to how we assess casualties." That is just the shitty reality of the battlefield now. And thankfully, it's good that the U.S. Army is at least starting to wake up to it, right? I can tell you, I received no training and no exercising in digging a fighting position. It was just not necessary on the battlefield. Instead, you focused on the tasks you needed to do to win the war. Just like if you went through basic training in a Ukrainian unit, you'd probably focus almost exclusively on the skills necessary to survive in trenches, in a trench warfare situation. So I think this is a good sign and a sign that this is exactly where you want the U.S. military to be. And the fact is, though, it's probably realizing like, hey, we got caught pretty flat-footed on this one. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you. Be sure to check us out, combatvetnews.com. New video drops today. So definitely want to take a look at it. And that's all I had. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.